If you're a Christian, you might be eating foods God specifically said are unclean. I'm not talking about modern health trends or the latest diet craze. I'm talking about warnings straight from the Bible, God's own word. And whether you've read them before or not, what you're about to hear might completely change the way you think about your next meal. These commands aren't hidden in some obscure footnote. They're right there in the same Bible we open every Sunday. In the Old Testament, God gave His people very specific instructions about what they should and should not eat, and you'll find them most clearly laid out in the book of Leviticus chapter 11 and the book of Deuteronomy chapter 14. And while many Christians have been taught to think those Old Testament laws don't apply anymore, there are principles here that even the New Testament reinforces, commands repeated by the apostles to early believers. Before you dismiss this as just Old Testament stuff, you should know that some of these prohibitions weren't just ceremonial. Many of them were rooted in God's concern for purity, holiness, and health, things that still matter today. These weren't arbitrary rules. They were part of God's design to set His people apart, protect them from disease, and remind them daily of their relationship with Him. And if God called something unclean, we have to ask, who are we to call it food? So let's start with one of the most popular and most controversial forbidden foods, pork. The Bible addresses this in Leviticus chapter 11 verse 7, which says, "And the pig, though it has a divided hoof, does not chew the cud. It is unclean for you." God's instruction here is simple. Don't eat pig. And this wasn't just about a specific cooking style. This was an outright prohibition. The pig was classified as unclean because it met only one of God's two requirements for land animals. It had a split hoof, but it didn't chew the cud. Now, in today's culture, pork is everywhere. Bacon at breakfast, ham at Christmas, barbecue ribs on the weekend. It's almost a cultural icon in many countries. But God's people in the Bible were told to leave it completely off the menu. Why? While the Bible doesn't give a detailed health explanation, history and science have shown that pigs can carry parasites and diseases, especially in times without refrigeration or modern hygiene. But beyond the physical side, God set these rules to teach His people obedience and separation from the nations around them who didn't follow Him. Even in modern times, some Christians choose to follow this command, not because they believe they're under the old law, but because they believe God's wisdom never changes. And for many, it's about honoring His word in every area of life, even diet. Next food is shellfish. This one catches people off guard because seafood is often considered healthy. But in Leviticus chapter 11, verses 10 through 12, God makes another clear statement. "But all creatures in the seas or streams that do not have fins and scales, whether among all the swarming things or among all the other living creatures in the water, you are to regard as unclean. And since you are to regard them as unclean, you must not eat their meat. You must regard their carcasses as unclean. Anything living in the water that does not have fins and scales is to be regarded as unclean by you. That means no shrimp, no crab, no lobster, no clams, no oysters, no squid." According to God's dietary laws, these are detestable. And again, this wasn't about taste, it was about classification. If it lives in the water, it must have both fins and scales to be considered clean. If you think about it, shellfish are scavengers. Their job in nature is to clean the ocean floor by eating decaying matter. They're essentially the cleanup crew of the sea, and in God's design, He didn't intend for the cleanup crew to be on our dinner plate. In many coastal cultures, these foods are prized delicacies, but for Israel, they were a direct violation of God's law. And just like pork, the issue wasn't only about physical health, it was about holiness. God was teaching His people to discern between clean and unclean, holy and unholy, right down to what they ate. Next food is interesting. It's blood. Now, this is where the Bible gets very direct, and the command is repeated both in the Old and New Testaments. In the book of Acts chapter 15 verse 20, the early church leaders wrote to Gentile believers telling them to abstain from food polluted by idols, from sexual immorality, from the meat of strangled animals and from blood. This was not an Old Testament-only command. This was the apostles, after Jesus' resurrection, telling Christians not to eat blood. If we go back to the Old Testament, in Leviticus chapter 17 verses 10 through 14, God says, "I will set my face against any Israelite or any foreigner residing among them who eats blood, and I will cut them off from the people. For the life of a creature is in the blood, and I have given it to you to make atonement for yourselves on the altar. It is the blood that makes atonement for one's life. Therefore I say to the Israelites, none of you may eat blood, nor may any foreigner residing among you eat blood. Any Israelite or any foreigner residing among you who hunts any animal or bird that may be eaten must drain out the blood and cover it with earth, because the life of every creature is its blood. That is why I have said to the Israelites, you must not eat the blood of any creature, because the life of every creature is its blood. Anyone who eats it must be cut off." This is one of the strongest warnings in Scripture when it comes to food. God directly ties the prohibition against eating blood to the sacredness of life itself. Blood, in God's eyes, isn't just another part of the animal. It's where the life resides, and life belongs to God alone. In practical terms, this means avoiding things like blood sausage or certain cultural dishes made with raw or cooked blood. It also explains why, in biblical times, meat had to be fully drained of blood before it could be eaten. Even rare or undercooked meat, where blood is still visible, would have been off limits. What's striking here is that this command wasn't just about avoiding disease. It was a deeply spiritual matter. God's people were to handle blood with reverence, not consumption, because it pointed to the sacrificial system where blood was shed for the atonement of sin, a foreshadowing of the ultimate sacrifice of Jesus Christ, whose blood cleanses us from sin. Next food to avoid are animals that died on their own. This one might seem obvious, but God made it a direct command in Deuteronomy chapter 14 verse 21. Do not eat anything you find already dead. You may give it to the foreigner residing in any of your towns, and they may eat it, or you may sell it to any other foreigner. But you are a people holy to the Lord your God. Do not cook a young goat in its mother's milk. In other words, if an animal died on its own, whether by disease, accident, or old age, it was not to be eaten by God's people. This included anything we might call carrion, or, in modern terms, roadkill. Why such a rule? First, animals that die on their own may have died from illness or injury, which means eating them could carry a serious health risk. Without proper slaughter, the blood would not be drained, and as we've already learned, blood was sacred and not to be consumed. But beyond physical health, the deeper issue was holiness. God said, "You are a people holy to the Lord your God." That holiness was to be reflected in every area of life, including diet. Eating an animal found dead blurred the line between the clean and the unclean, the sacred and the common. God wanted his people to be different from the nations around them, who had no problem eating such meat. Even today, this principle speaks to us. While it's rare for most of us to find a dead animal and consider eating it, the underlying truth is that we are called to care about the source of our food, to ensure it is handled in a way that honors God's commands. It's about intentional living, not just eating whatever is convenient or cheap, but making choices that align with our identity as God's people. Another food to avoid are predatory birds. In Leviticus chapter 11 verses 13 through 19, God gives a very specific list of birds his people must not eat. These are the birds you are to regard as unclean and not eat because they are unclean: the eagle, the vulture, the black vulture, the red kite, any kind of black kite, any kind of raven, the horned owl, the screech owl, the gull, any kind of hawk, the little owl, the cormorant, the great owl, the white owl, the desert owl, the osprey, the stork, any kind of heron, the hoopoe and the bat. These birds have one thing in common. They are either predators or scavengers. They hunt live prey or feed on dead animals. In nature, they play an important role in cleaning up decay, but God's people were not to eat them. Why? For one, Scavenger birds often carry diseases from the carcasses they consume. But more importantly, God was teaching his people to avoid consuming what he had set apart for a different purpose. These birds were part of his natural cleanup system, not part of his menu for humanity. Notice, too, that many of these birds were associated with death and unclean environments. Vultures, for example, are almost a universal symbol of decay and lifelessness. Ravens are often linked in Scripture to desolate places. Owls and bats were considered unclean not only because of diet, but because of the environments they inhabited. Today, most people in Western cultures don't eat these birds, but in some parts of the world, they are still considered food. And while the physical risks remain, the deeper takeaway for us is about spiritual discernment. Just because something is technically edible does not mean it is spiritually or morally wise to consume. God calls us to make choices that reflect purity, wisdom, and respect for his creation's intended order. Next food to avoid is meat that is sacrificed to idols. This last one brings us into a very clear New Testament command. In Acts chapter 15, verse 29, the early church leaders instructed new Gentile believers, "You are to abstain from food sacrificed to idols, from blood, from the meat of strangled animals, and from sexual immorality. You will do well to avoid these things." Farewell. Paul also addresses this in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 20 through 21, saying, "No, but the sacrifices of pagans are offered to demons, not to God, and I do not want you to be participants with demons. You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons too. You cannot have a part in both the Lord's table and the table of demons." In the first century world, much of the meat sold in marketplaces had been previously offered in sacrifice to pagan gods. Eating such meat wasn't just about food, it was about spiritual alignment. To eat it was, in a symbolic sense, to participate in the worship of those false gods. Today, this may seem less directly relevant. Most of us don't encounter meat that's been literally sacrificed to idols before being sold. But the principle still matters. It warns us to be aware of the spiritual associations and origins of what we consume, not just in food, but in every aspect of life. If a certain product, event, or even brand is deeply tied to practices that dishonor God, we should think twice before participating. It's not just about avoiding pagan rituals. It's about making sure our choices don't tie us, even subtly, to spiritual corruption. So why do these warnings still matter today? Because God never gave instructions without purpose. Every command in his word reveals something about his nature, his design, and his desire for his people. These food laws weren't random. They were a daily reminder that God's people are set apart. And that truth has not changed. For the believer, the question is not simply, "Can I eat this?" but, "Does this honor God?" When we choose to follow his word, even in the smallest areas like what we put on our plate, we are declaring that his authority matters more than our cravings, culture, or convenience. This isn't about legalism. It's not about earning salvation through diet. It's about living in a way that reflects our identity as children of God. Jesus said in John chapter 14, verse 15, "If you love me, keep my commands." Love for him is demonstrated in obedience. And while some will argue that these dietary laws were part of the Old Covenant, the truth is that the principles behind them, purity, holiness, separation from sin, and reverence for God, are timeless. The apostles themselves carried several of these commands into the New Testament, which shows us they were not simply discarded. Leviticus chapter 11 and Deuteronomy chapter 14 still stand as testimonies of God's wisdom. They remind us that what we consume physically can reflect what we consume spiritually. Just as God called his people to distinguish between the clean and the unclean in food, he calls us today to distinguish between the holy and the unholy in every part of our lives. So before you take that next bite, ask yourself a simple question. If God called it unclean, why would we call it food?